Testing, one, two, three. Okie dokie. We're going to continue. Welcome to This and Dat, 26 September. Saints to Cecilia's Subsumption, Chapter 1. We're going to continue with that. It's the text is called Subsumption in Kant, Hegel, and Marx. And I think we'll start where we left off, and that is Hegel's critique of subsumption. Hang in there. Hegel's critique of subsumption. The significance of Kant's critique of theoretical reason for Hegelian philosophy lies not only in the former's quest to demonstrate which kind of judgments about objects are legitimate, taken here to mean universally valid, in the sense expounded above, but arises equally from its conclusion that these judgments have already taken place when we experience an object. Kant discovered the conceptual mediation that is in the form of judgments of subsumption under pure concepts implicit in all apparently immediate knowledge. This transition from immediacy to its mediating condition is a movement derived from Kant's pre-critical logic, where discrete concepts were shown to be the product of subsumptive judgment acts. Footnote 79. But whilst in formal logic, thought need only find agreement with itself in order to produce valid judgments in the sphere of experience dealt with in the first critique, that is transcendental logic, thought must find agreement with its other. That in the judgment, which is not a determination of thought, that is sensible intuition, in order for an object to be known. Transcendental logic represents Kant's attempt to guarantee the correspondence of thought and object by enclosing them within a unifying, law-bound structure of subjectivity. On this account, to know an object is to have specified subsumptively the consistency of its empirical content according to the basic categorical determinations of the understanding. This is the epistemological context in which subsumption emerges in the critique of pure reason as a condition of possibility for the experience of objects, which is equated with knowledge thereof. And note, of course, this is the issue of a kind of an attack on solipsism, that is, to know knowledge, know objects. For Hegel, Kant was correct to argue that thought is always implicit in the constitution of objectivity, and that this involvement is a process entirely immanent and internal to consciousness. Hegel recognized that in subsuming intuitions under concepts in this way, consciousness permeates them with itself, with its own unity and self-relation, sublating their particular immediacy into the universality and determinateness that for him, as for Kant, constitute objectivity. So, quote, the comprehension of an object consists in nothing else than that the ego makes it its own, pervades it, and brings it into its own form, that is, into the universality that it is immediately a determinateness, or a determinateness that is immediately universality. As intuited, or even in ordinary conception, the object is still something external and alien. When it is comprehended, the being in and for itself, which it possesses in intuition and pictorial thought, is transformed into a positedness. The I, in thinking it, pervades it. Footnote 80, close quote. In accordance with critical philosophy's new understanding of the object as pre-constituted by the spontaneity of the I, Hegel holds that the determinations of the object emerge from the subjective process of its comprehension. Crucial to this conception is Kant's attempt in the transcendental deduction to reciprocally derive both the categories under which the manifold is subsumed from the unity of the I, and simultaneously the unity of the I from the act of thinking the object under these categories. It is the equation of conceptual universality with the unity of the pure I arising from this deduction that dissolves the opposition between truth and subjectivity, and gives rise to a conception of the object as mediated. Nobody thinks like this when they're watching television, of course. This forms the general structure of transcendental logic with which Hegel's philosophy engages. But despite his affinities with it, Hegel took issue with Kant's model of subsumptive cognition in three primary respects. Number one, the modeling of the apperceptive I, and therefore the transcendental subject, on the empirical psychological individual. Number two, the uncritical appropriation of the categories of the understanding from Aristotelian logic. Remember, this is uncritical appropriation. Number three, the limitation of truth to objects of experience alone, which left critical philosophy still mired in the sphere of empirical appearance. Metacritically outlining these limits to Kant's model of cognition allowed Hegel to incorporate the basic movement of transcendental critique from condition to condition within a reconstructed outline of both the elements and the total structure of unity of Kant's thought, of Kantian thought. Neither of these two aspects Hegel contested was the product of a fully immanent philosophical derivation, and much extraneous and unjustified content had been smuggled into Kant's philosophy. But Hegel did not reject the basic structure of opposition between the unity and determinateness of self-consciousness. Instead, he subjected them to the dialectical critique that would produce, number one, phenomenology of spirit in reference to transcendental subjectivity. Number two, a speculative logic in reference to the categories. And number three, a new conception of truth as speculative totality. These transformations bear on the status of subsumption within Hegel's system, insofar as both the structured context of the subsumptive act and the specific determination executed by it are subject to a new derivation that fundamentally alters their nature. So all that happens when you watch TV, yes. Hegel's modification of the concept of subsumption begins first and foremost with his critique of the constitutive divisions of transcendental logic, specifically those which precipitate the emergence of subsumption in the critique of pure reason. That is, the basic opposition of the concepts of understanding and the manifold of intuition carried over from Kant's distinction between the empty form of thought given in general logic and the content to which it is applied. The crucial consequence of this division is that Kantian philosophy takes the subsumed to be entirely unhomogeneous to that which subsumes it, such that for Hegel, the subsumption amounts to an external imposition on the matter given in intuition. Quote, the empirical material, the manifold of intuition and representation, first exists on its own account, and then the understanding approaches it, brings unity into it, and by abstraction raises it to the form of universality. Footnote 81, close quote. Thought thus pervades intuition to know it as its own. Thought thus pervades intuition to know it as its own, but does so coercively, imposing its own relations and mediation upon it, rather than drawing out the truth of those that are already present within it. The manifold neither has nor develops an inner concrete universality, and only obtains universality when the functions of unity are given by the understanding that has been determined in it subsumptively. That's why we watch Rick and Morty. For Hegel, this model is consonant with the worldview of Newtonian science, for which the universal, the genus, etc., constituted in the particular, is not determined on its own account, nor is it intrinsically connected with what is particular, but universal and particular are mutually external and contingent, just as the particularities that are combined are, on their own account, external to each other and contingent. Footnote 82. On the basis of this standpoint, it appears that I possess concepts and the concept, big C, just as I also possess a coat, complexion, and other external properties. And you can see sort of where Marx is going with this. Despite their a priori interconnection, concepts and intuitions, remain utterly distinct and implicitly self-sufficient sources of cognition within the Kantian system. Indeed, it is precisely this difference that for Kant necessitates their mediation in a third thing, the transcendental schema. Hegel opposed this fixed externality of faculties, arguing that the difference between sensible intuition and concepts is one only of the forms of a content that remains one and the same. Footnote 84. In Faith and Knowledge, Hegel's early review of the reflective philosophies of his time, the primary distinction between intuitive and conceptual syntheses appears simply in that the concept grasps the positedness of determinations in distinction from its own self. Synthetic unity is only concept because it binds the difference in such a way that it also steps outside of it and faces it in relative antithesis. Footnote 85, close quote. Whilst the centrality of synthetic unity would be reduced in Hegel's later works, the emphasis on a truly necessary, absolute, original identity of opposites would be retained. In opposition to the Kantian idea of an original division of the faculties that constitute only an aggregate and not a system. Hegel thus disparages the weakness of the subsumptive-synthetic relation between concepts and intuitions that is supposed to ground the truth of experience for Kant, describing it as a relation that unites the two elements of cognition, in an external, superficial way, just as a piece of wood and a leg might be bound together by a cord. Such unity is not for Hegel a properly philosophical unity in which relations between elements and higher determinations are developed immanently out of those elements as their implicit conditions. Quote, the very expression synthesis easily recalls the conception of an external unity and a mere combination of entities that are intrinsically separate. Footnote 88. Kantianism, by asserting a model of mechanical connection between independent elements, gives the opposition of thought and external reality held by normal consciousness a philosophical articulation, reproducing it in the transcendental distinction between the object as it is for us and as it is in itself. Because our sensible mode of intuiting the external object is deficient, lacks conceptual coherence and unity, it must be subsumed under an alien scheme of universality. And this subsumption, under the species, alters what is immediate. Only the object for us, that which results from subsumptive judgment, is true for Kant. And thus this truth is paradoxically qualified as having no bearing on the things as it might actually be, lost as it is in the process of its comprehension. For Hegel, this expulsion of the in itself from the realm of knowledge leads Kantianism to yield only of a truth of the false. Quote, it seems absurd. If what we want is knowledge of external objects, to alter these external objects by our very abstractive activity upon them. Quite absurd to want to come to know things as they are in themselves and yet alter them thus receiving things into our knowledge only as altered. The alteration consists in the fact that we separate off what is singular or external and hold the truth of the thing to lie in what is universal, rather than in what is singular or external. Quite oddly, for Kant, it is by altering things that we are persuaded that we secure their inner truth. See, that's that fundamental difference. Footnote 90, close quote. The one-sidedness of the structure of determination is, on Hegel's account, exactly what undermines the Kantian conception of truth, reducing it to a tautological affirmation of subjectivity that assimilates consciousness as other, the in itself, to itself, while simultaneously reducing itself qua I to the empirical. That's the error of formalism. It thereby fails to recognize in anything other than a nominal sense that expounded in Kant's refutation of idealism, the subject's own mediation in and through this other, with the process of subsumption effected unilaterally and mechanically, even by Kant's own admission, upon this sensibly given material. Footnote 91. The understanding damn it. The understanding is in this way an intrinsically empty form, which, on the one hand, obtains a reality through the said given content, and on the other hand, abstracts from that content. That is to say, lets it drop as something useless. 92. And yet, in spite of this, transcendental subjectivity cannot entirely dispose of the in itself that stands beyond it. It remains beholden to precisely that which it repudiates. The conceptual identity produced by the understanding finds itself immediately confronted by, or next to, an infinite non-identity with which it must coalesce in some incomprehensible way. Footnote 93. The epistemological horizon of Kantian philosophy, the limit of comprehension implied by it, therefore remains entirely within the antithesis between nature and reason, subject and object, thought and being, willing and acting, finite and infinite, etc., because of its original incapacity to know the object as it really is. Footnote 94, quote, a formal idealism which in this way sets an absolute ego point in its intellect on one side and an absolute manifold of sensation on the other side, is a dualism. Footnote 95. Remind yourself of what happens when you encounter modern art, right? Particularly abstract modern art. We could hypothesize what happens within, for example, the Rothko Chapel, right? Kant does, of course, recognize the higher unity that would resolve these oppositions in the form of reason's orientation toward the unconditioned. However, this orientation, far from genuinely grounding the unifying movement of thought, has, in contrast to the object universality of the understanding's fixed determinations, only the inferior status of being responsible for, at best, the production of regulative principles, and at worst, transcendental illusions. The constitutive oppositions of Kantianism are therefore superseded only subjectively in the ideas which have no objective, i.e., real truth content. Again, Hegel criticizes the division separating the discrete concepts of the understanding and the unifying tendency of reason, which Hegel simply calls the concept, as a characteristic limit of the reflective philosophy of subjectivity. Kantian philosophy, quote, Kantian philosophy declares finite cognition to be all that is possible. It falls back into absolute finitude and subjectivity, and the whole task and content of the philosophy is not the cognition of the absolute, but the cognition of this subjectivity, footnote 96. Because Kant aims at a critique of the finite intellect rather than the knowledge of the absolute, his philosophy is resigned to a progression in finite determinations, accepting that an endless aiming at the concrete is required for thought, a filling up in accordance with the rule which completion prescribes, albeit the completion never to be realized, only striven toward in the mode stipulated by its abstract universality. 97, footnote 97. Quote, Kantian philosophy leads knowledge into consciousness and self-consciousness, but from this standpoint, maintains it to be a subjective and finite knowledge. Thus, although it deals with the infinite idea expressing its formal categories and arriving at its concrete claims, it yet again denies this to be the truth, making it a simple subjective because it has once and all accepted finite knowledge as the fixed and ultimate standpoint. Footnote 98. We might remind ourselves, to think of more Kantian approaches to the problem of formalism. And sorry for the annotative footnote. For example, the works of Donald Cuspit. But anyway, it is precisely in the rejection of this finitude that Kant's critical differentiation between the truth of legitimate and illegitimate judgments of subsumption is called into question by Hegel. What we must ask then is how the character and effects of subsumptive judgment, as legitimate or illegitimate, are altered by Hegel's refutation of the static division between the aesthetic, analytical, and dialectical moments of transcendental subjectivity, and what role subsumption plays in Hegel's reconfigured concept of the subject as process. Section 2.1, a new derivation, overcoming the empirical epistemological boundary of Kant's philosophical claims, specifically the adherence to a structurally constitutive distinction of subject and object, is the task Hegel set out to achieve through his dialectical treatment of consciousness in the phenomenology of spirit. That's why more people spend their time on it. The phenomenology deals with the phenomenology deals with the development of the relation between consciousness and its object, progressing through the series of forms or shapes of experience, each of which specifies a different relationship of knowledge to its object. This developmental process passes from the immediacy of sense certainty through the emergence of self-consciousness from relations of recognition between individuals to the social forms of spirit, arriving ultimately at the standpoint of absolute knowing, from which the opposition between subject and object, that is substance, is sublated into the unity of spirit with itself, and the knowledge of experience is resolved into a pure ontology in the logic, i.e., not simply the determinations of the object as it appears to consciousness, but the pure determinations of the object as it actually is. Hegel's initial rupture with Kant consists in the fact that rather than attempting to ascertain the necessary content and structure of experience in order to then critically determine what counts as knowledge, for Hegel, the process of reflecting on knowledge cannot be divorced from knowledge itself, as illustrated by his well-known metaphor, which likens Kant's critical method to the desire to learn how to swim before getting into the water. Footnote 99. It's like Dunning-Kruger, for example, right? With this process, philosophy has already begun. It's not simply the final stage of consciousness taken in isolation that can be thought of as the pure standpoint of knowledge, but rather all the stages in the totality of their development that constitute the truth of knowledge as a process. In this movement, the passive subject itself perishes. It enters into the differences and the content and constitutes the determinateness, i.e., the differentiated content and its movement instead of remaining inertly over against it. Footnote 100. Subjectivity cannot thus be reduced to a static aggregation of principles and powers, but is instead grasped as the dynamic movement of the whole in its dialectical self-development. Now, this informs the status of subsumption in Hegel insofar as the Kantian I is premised on precisely this fixed division of faculties that Hegel rejects, specifically the dualism of sensibility and intellect, whose heterogeneous contents have to be brought synthetically into relation. The overcoming of precisely this division by virtue of subsumption under concepts forms the basis for the reciprocal establishment of the unity of consciousness and the consistency of experience in Kant's first critique. Hegel's dialectical critique of consciousness in the phenomenology, however, transforms this oppositional structure into a processual concept of subject as the organic self-development of an, in the last instance, objective process. The unity of consciousness is thus no longer a static structure of self-relation, but the dynamic unfolding of knowing through its various shapes or moments. Integral to this movement is the supersession of the finite standpoint of individual consciousness and the development of a social concept of subjectivity, emerging in the transition from subject-object relations to subject-subject, and then subject-substance relations and the various forms of ethical life. Hegel's exposition attempts to demonstrate in the first place that interpersonal relations are an implicit condition for the existence of individual self-consciousness. At this stage, the problem ceases to have solely epistemological significance, i.e. of the correspondence between thought and object, and instead becomes a problem of social recognition, because the object that appears to consciousness is revealed to itself to be another free self-consciousness, i.e. a subject. What is at stake here is the way in which objective structures of recognition produce contradictory relations of misrecognition between individual self-consciousness. Not only is the subsumption of intuitions under concepts that is so fundamental for Kant thereby demoted to a partial and limited stage in this conceptual development, but the very constitutive limit of knowledge set out by Kant. That is, individual empirical experience is superseded as consciousness leaves behind it the colorful show of the sensuous here and now. Footnote 101. Subsequently, that's the point in Hegel's exposition where social relations emerge as objective structures rather than contingent relations between isolated individuals. That is, with the emergence of spirit, contradiction arises primarily at the level of the relation between individual self-consciousnesses, the I, which is subject, and the forms of social relations or of ethical life that unite them, the we, that is substance. Although Hegel does not explicitly discuss these contradictions in terms of subsumption, their conceptual structure is homologous with what he identified as two defining features of Kantian subsumption, that is, the weak synthetic unity of heterogeneous elements and the coercive determination of individual elements under an abstract universality. Insofar as subsumptive relations thus obtain at the level of structures of spirit, they are relations between individuals and the universality of the social form that they exist within and are constituted by, in contrast to the simple case of domination of one self-consciousness by another, described in the section on lordship and bondage. This can occur in terms of the dominant universality of the social substance This could occur in terms of the dominant universality of the social substance, which subsumes individuals with antithetical desires, as in the case of ethical life, or of the alienated abstract universality of individual personhood, under which the community proper is subsumed, as, for example, with private property in ancient Rome. Here, we find that the same structure of double determination that was operative in Kant's theory of subsumption, and which distinguished between, number one, the individual representations that are bound together by concepts, and number two, the relation of these unified representations to the compositional totality in which they're unified, is reproduced at the level of, number one, relations of recognition between individuals, and number two, relations of recognition between individuals and the community. Andrew Chitty draws attention to this in the following claim, quote, fully realized or absolute spirit is constituted only when this mutual recognition between individuals that brings into existence a universal self is supplemented by a second mutual recognition between this universal self and the individuals that compose it, or between individuals acting as members of this individual self and the same individuals acting as particular individuals. You see, this is the limit of methodological individualism, footnote 102. This is not necessary to give an in-depth analysis of all subsumptive relations and their sublation in the phenomenology. What is pertinent to the problematic as a whole is the fundamental transformation of the concept of a subject that Hegel carries out. With Kant, the fixed transcendental structure of subjectivity provides both the context and resources that give rise to subsumptive judgment acts. Hegel lauds the Critique of Pure Reason because in it, the unity which constitutes the nature of the concept is recognized as the original synthetic unity of apperception, as unity of the I think or of self-consciousness. But if this conception of the I is expanded, as it is in the phenomenology, then the context and resources for subsumption are thereby also altered. Footnote 103. More important for the present inquiry is the aforementioned transition that occurs in the course of the process of the subjective development of spirit and leads to the exposition of properly social as opposed to merely interpersonal forms of self-consciousness. This transition from self-consciousness to spirit lays the foundation for the analysis of a concept of subsumption that pertains to individuals subsumed under objectively universal structures of sociality, which constitute their collective and individual identity and practices. That's why, it's just a joke, right? Why try to fire the guy from the network? We are no longer dealing with synthetic judgment acts internal to an individual consciousness, but with the development of relational social forms that determine individual identities and collective practices in terms of both their subjective and objective implications as developed in the phenomenology and the philosophy of right. This is the first essential modification to the problem of subsumption that we can find in Hegel. And let me end at the end of this paragraph because I've already overgone my time. There's a second related aspect of Hegel's critique of subsumption in Kant that follows directly from this new concept of the subject as process. The issue of the content of that process, i.e. its determinate stages or shapes, and their objective status once the phenomenological derivation of ontology as logic has been achieved. This consists, first and foremost, in a critique of the specific forms of conceptual universality under which subsumption can occur, as well as their status as actual abstractions, rather than determinations of the object whose validity is limited to its appearance for us. The exposition given by Hegel in the Science of Logic text seeks to submit the categories of thought to a rigorous inquiry that does not depend on their belonging to an empirical consciousness. Hegel believed that he had already achieved the imminent development of self-conscious spirit into logic with, of course, the phenomenology, but attempts to dialectically develop the determination of thought out of their own immanent content and contradiction. Footnote 104. Hegel, therefore, introduces not only a new conception of subjectivity, but also of logic, in the course of which the conceptual form of subsumption will be posited with a higher determinacy. Okay, I'll stop there. Sorry for the tardiness. And I will go ahead now and stop the, stop the live stream and stop the share. Let me thank you again for your attention